Hello and welcome. We're pleased to have you join us for today's webinar, Leadership Longevity, Addressing Through the Employee Lifecycle. This webinar is co-hosted by HR.com and CPP Incorporated. CPP is the exclusive publisher of several powerful assessments, including the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and the CPI 260. My name is Laura Simons, Product Marketing Manager here at CPP, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. Today's webinar will run approximately 1 hour with the last 10 to 15 minutes reserved for questions and answers. If you do have a question, please submit it via the questions box located on the right side of your screen. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll address as many as possible at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll send out a link to the recording soon, as well as a copy of the presentation slides and other resources. So, today's speaker is Dr. Sarita Bakuni. Sarita is a licensed psychologist, senior organizational development consultant, and assessment expert, and a trainer of CPP's certification programs. She has vast experience in a wide range of industries, including healthcare, technology, retail, and education. She works with organizations to develop training programs, deliver team-building programs, implement career development initiatives, create diversity empowerment programs, provide coaching, and in outplacement and selection. Sarita, welcome. I'd like to turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Laura. I'm really happy to be here today and looking forward to having a robust conversation with some questions at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to cover a lot of ground with these two instruments. So I'm going to jump in and get started and talk about what our goals are in spending time together today. One of the things that we keep in mind during these webinars is that we all come with a different level of experience around using the instruments, around applying them, and best practices. So my hope is to kind of shoot in the middle in terms of competencies and expertise with these two instruments, the MBTI and the CPI 260. And so for some of you, I'll ask for patience if it seems redundant. And for others of you, please ask questions when we're finished at the end. But what we hope to do is really spend some time talking about the conversation that happens between the Myers-Briggs and the CPI 260. There are so many different instruments to choose between, and when we're working with talent professionals and really thinking about helping them to enhance their functioning and understanding, we really want to spend our time and money on things that are effective. So we'll be taking a look at how understanding competencies help us take a look at the kinds of performance that's necessary and really fine-tuning that. We've heard a lot about emotional intelligence lately and how the impact of stress can change and shift our management and leadership styles, so we're going to be talking about that. Looking at drivers of leadership and management behaviors. Where do we go to first when we're making decisions and choices about executing leadership? Talking about certain and specific scales on the CPI 260 that are really critical in understanding so that you can work with your leaders to help them be more effective. And then really leveraging where you're starting from in terms of what happens naturally and where do you need to stretch to really get the most out of your talents and to really recognize what your growth opportunities are. So to look at a framework for our session and think about the employee life cycle, there have been many conversations about where does it start, where does it end, and it's pretty fluid throughout in terms of how we identify the stages. Now within your organization, the stages may be a little bit different, but we found that there's mostly some universality in terms of identifying them in this way. So I'll go through them individually. First, we're looking at selection. So after 9/11, there was a huge investment made in identifying talent and the right fit And certainly in the past few years, we've seen, some areas where people were chosen for positions where judgment was critical and was not executed well. So during the selection process, we want to make sure that we're pairing people in terms of their strengths and style and their fit with the position, and maybe even putting them in this position where they have an opportunity to grow, and as well as mentoring others. So during the selection process, it's really important to kind of have the markers of what success looks like and matching people with those competencies. Next, we go to onboarding. As we're bringing people into the organization, then what do we do? Once they're in, how do we manage a seamless transition for people so that they know not just the company culture and what is needed in terms of effective performance, but also working with other people, what the expectations are, and how they can do that successfully. Next is identifying high potentials. How do you know where the talent is and what it takes at each position for people to really be successful? And what kind of a system and a program do you have in place to identify the qualities that really create leaders for your organization? And then we'll take a look at style differences and how we can leverage those. The goal is not to create a homogeneous workforce so that everyone has the same qualities, of course, but really leveraging the differences so they make an impact. And then another thing that we've been hearing a lot about is as people matriculate through the organization and they reach a higher level, the things that they were doing don't really work anymore in terms of early leadership, and their early role has changed. And so what do they need to do to adjust in terms of looking at their leadership a little bit differently and what's necessary? And then finally, succession planning, putting a plan in place so that identifying where they are now, where they want to be, and what's necessary to fill that gap in terms of competencies. So these are kind of the terms that we'll be using as we go through. So again, as we think about selection, one thing I really want to emphasize with MBTI, we know that the MBTI looks at our style in terms of our preferences. It's not a trait instrument. It's not indicated for selection. And it's not something that can tell us, yes, we're looking for a CFO when we want an ISTJ. That's not at all how we want to use the instrument. What we want to do is say, let's take a look at the person's style. Where do they get their energy? How do they make decisions? What kinds of information do they know and trust? How do they organize themselves within the organization? And really take a look at what's the impact of their style going to be. What I have seen and what I have done consistently that's really helpful is after the selection process, when you want to keep and maintain talent. During the onboarding process, the MBTI is tremendously helpful. But again, it is not a selection instrument. That's where the CPI 260 comes in as a selection instrument to really help us make sure that we're paying attention to leaders and the competencies that are necessary. So as we're using the CPI 260, and for those of you that are familiar with it, this is an instrument that CPP collaborated with the Center for Creative Leadership. And originally, when Harrison wrote the CPI, he was looking for what is the ideal manager? What are the characteristics and competencies that really put a person in a position to be successful? And so as we've continued to test out those competencies, the CPI 260 was created out of a collaboration with the Center for Creative Leadership. And you're comparing yourself when you take the 260 to other successful on-track executive and managers that are really tracking for those executive positions. So when you look at these specific scales, you're comparing them to 6,000 managers from global companies that are already in line for those kinds of positions. So the first scale that we look at is level of satisfaction. And for those of you that are familiar with the report, that's early in the report. And it really helps us identify, excuse me, is this person, have they tapped into their capabilities, and are they using their abilities to their fullest potential? At what level are they performing? And that's a scale from 0 to 7. We see most people between 4 and 6, 3 and 5, with the mean being around that 4 to 5 level. But really, executive and managers, we want to see them around 5, 6, and even sometimes we do see people at a 7. So that's really an indicator of well-being, resiliency. When things are difficult, are they going to make lemonade out of lemons, or are they going to retract and kind of, some people become paralyzed in the face of difficult choices. So that's one thing we want to take a look at. The other is good impression, and one of the reasons I really like using the 260 is that it helps us really assess during the selection process when someone takes a lot of opportunities to present themselves in a favorable light, their good impression scale is high, and by high I mean above 70. So that's another indicator that this is a person that might not be entirely honest with themselves in terms of their presentation. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're deliberately lying, it just means that they're really taking opportunities to present themselves. When we think about the composition of a leader, we really want to pay attention to dominance and empathy. These are two scales on the CPI 260 that really speak to dominance, how do you influence others, what's your confidence like in terms of making tough choices and decisions, and empathy, are you able to think about how other people might respond to those choices, and are you able to put yourself in a position where you can think about the impact on people? So with these two skills, one without the other, or an overabundance of dominance with an absence of empathy, is not a positive leadership style. We hear from Kenneth Blanchard about situational leadership and different styles of kind of approaching what the best kind of leadership is for your organization. But across the board, when we have dominance that's too high, 75, 80, even 73 sometimes, we know that that's not a person that's going to be as collaborative unless we see that empathy coming up in the 60s, where we can say, yes, this is a person that's going to consider the impact on people. The next skill that's important is achievement via conformance, and that asks the question, are you a person that wants to be successful within the rubric of what is expected in the organization? If people tell you what they expect of you, if people show you what the rules are, and you have a score in the mid-50s, mid-60s for achievement via conformance, that means you want to follow the rules instead of break the rules. And that's important in terms of staying on track with a mission and company goals as a leader. And then the last two are critically important in terms, especially as we see problem solving become more and more important with more organizations working lean and people and leaders being responsible for more and more roles as we're managing the current global economy. Flexibility becomes critical in terms of trying different things, assessing new options in problem solving, and really moving away from a rigid style where you always do what you've always done. Finally, sensitivity is one of those scales that we don't necessarily, a lot of these scales we want them to be on the higher side. Sensitivity, we want it to be on the lower side, in the 40s, sometimes it's even in the 30s. And that means that you can make the tough calls, and making the choice that's right for your organization and for your group is more important than being liked or being popular. We've all worked with those leaders who want to be your friend, and they put relationships in a place that sometimes interfere with being effective. And of course, everyone knows that relationships are pivotal in making critical choices, but they can't overarch making a tough decision where people might not like it. So these are some of the skills that we really have to pay attention to on the 260 when we're thinking about understanding the impact of leadership. So as I said earlier, once you know that the person is in the right place and the fit is procured, then how do you help them assimilate? How do you help them learn about organizational culture? A couple weeks ago I was working with a client, and he was talking about the process of recruiting. He's finishing his MBA and received a job at a top 5 firm. He said, I feel like in some ways I've gone from being Cinderella to the ugly stepsister, because when I joined the company, there was a lot of romance and a lot of wooing that went on, but once I got there, it was like nobody was there, and I really didn't know where to go. And I found that really affected. I wondered if I made the wrong choice. And we had a long conversation about that in terms of what happens once you get in the organization if you have a hard time understanding the culture of that organization and where to go, what your go-to person is for this kind of project or that kind of project, and really where the people are that can help you maximize your potential and the work that you're doing. So really using these two instruments can help people in terms of understanding their style and their strengths in style with their preferences to be strategic. These are the things that will help me understand the organization a little bit differently. So this next slide, we're looking at, on the left-hand side, the 4 different lifestyles of the CPI 260. And in the middle, we're looking at the MBTI function pairs. And so as a reminder, the function pairs are the 2 letters in the middle of the Myers-Briggs that help us identify our dominant function and our auxiliary function, what we drive with, and our wing person, so to speak, what people see first sometimes, and really what comes in as a support to that dominant function. So when we blend that with the 4 different styles, and on the CPI 260, often we see implementers as the most common kind of manager. About 60 to 80% of all managers tend to fall within that implementer category. And these are the people who are the go-getters, they're the doers, they really are ambitious, charismatic at their best. And then the supporters, we see that happen about 5 to 10% of the time with leaders. They're really behind the scenes and they're team players, but they're not necessarily in the limelight. The innovators, we see about 15% of the time. And those are people that really want to push the edge of what's capable and what's possible within the organization. And then the visualizers, we don't see as often, about 5% of the time. But they're also people who really want to have a vision and move the organization forward, but they do it in kind of a more behind-the-scenes way. So when we blend these styles with the functional pair, these are some characteristics that they share. Implementers look different based on the functional pair of MBTI, and I'll use that first one, implementer, as an example. When we see leaders that are implementers that share that sensing and thinking, the detail orientation with the logic, they can be very intense, they pay attention to task first, they are meticulously focused, and people will often say that their focus can be predominantly on task. With the SF, the detail orientation and the feeling, this is the functional pair that's called the servant leader. And these implementers are about getting it done for people, very service-oriented, very personable. The next one, the intuitive feeler, these are people who want ideas for the empowerment of people. And they want to get things done in terms of advocating for their direct reports and advocating for even the organization in terms of being better. And the last one, the intuitive thinkers, are about bringing the organization forward, putting together a strategy, being original, and competence is very important for an intuitive thinker, ideas and logic. So that's an example of how to blend this chart and how to really look at these 4 different styles and get a sense of how the data speaks to each other to really give us a more holistic idea of what we can pay attention to. It also helps us pay attention to what are people going to need first in terms of feeling comfortable in their role, feeling comfortable in taking risks as leaders. Then, once the person is acclimated to the organization, how do you know where there's an opportunity for really stellar performance that really sets them apart from other people? And that's where we really start looking at the CPI 260 to help us with strengths and style. And as some of you may know that use the 260, there's that snapshot on page 14 of the Coaching Report for Leaders that looks at strengths, assets that are likely a strength, opportunities for development, and then the third column, there's 2 arrows which indicate this is a behavior that sometimes can be a strength and that sometimes can be a liability. And an example of that is maybe someone's kind of stubborn in terms of their flexibility. Well, sometimes it's good to be stubborn in the face of adversity where you're making a difficult choice and you know you have the expertise and the competencies to move forward. Other times you want to have a little bit more flexibility. So, in our conversations about emotional intelligence, we consistently see that with high potentials, most people have technical proficiency and they get to a certain level in the organization, but that's where they kind of stall in terms of self-awareness and emotional intelligence. and really trying to be adaptive and flexing their personalities. And that's where helping people identify what potentially could derail them in stressful situations can really kind of help them to be a step ahead of a situation where they have to demonstrate leadership under stress and under duress, which we've seen in all different kinds of verticals and organizations, that this is something that's happening profoundly in our professional organizations. So the other thing that is really helpful when you blend the Myers-Briggs and the 260 is understanding the stress reactions. For those of you that are MBTI fluent, we talk about being in the grip of stress. And that's where when we are under duress or in a period of stress in our lives, our type dynamics change. And we start operating under our inferior function instead of our dominant function. So it's something we don't have as much access to. And so with each type, we want to make sure that we're reminding ourselves there's not a good type or a bad type. And we certainly don't want to start matching job titles with types. It's about the expression of leadership appropriately and identifying high potentials that have the ability to show that leadership, especially under duress. So when we start seeing people in the grip, and this is a chart that really speaks to, for each MBTI type, some opportunities when people feel stressed, what you can do as a remedy, and really what's the core performance area aligned with the competency on the CPI 260. And just taking an overview look at this chart, you can see how many of these have to do with self-management. And with all of the industry books, so often we know that getting people to a level of technical proficiency isn't the challenge. There's training and competencies and all kinds of ways that you can have people mentored for that. What ends up being more of a challenge is this self-management piece, for people to work on being self-aware and for people to work on their relationships. That's what really helps people, if you can engage with those high potentials early on and help them to identify what does happen to me when I'm stressed, what happens when I'm not operating from the best part of myself and I'm using a function and a preference that I'm not as fluent with, what usually happens. And here's an example of some of the things that happens. So I'll look at, I'm an ENTJ. So one of the things that happens with ENTJs when we're in the grip is we become incredibly impatient and we want everything to happen now, yesterday, last week, and typically ENTJs are not incredibly patient, but it's something you really, really have to work on. So when that happens, the opportunity when you're in the grip is that you really have to pay attention to the fact that you have to pause, take a step, take a breath, and talk with someone that you trust on the team to talk about why it is that you feel impatient, and accepting that for whatever reason the pace of this program is not going to the way that you would like it to. So sometimes, depending on the type, and again, when you have an introverted process, that affects whether your dominant preference is extroverted or introverted, and you know, because of time constraints we can't get into the type dynamics completely, but overall we know that people that have an extroverted preference become more introverted under stress, and people who have an introverted preference become more extroverted under stress. So that's one of the ways that we can recognize, wow, this behavior looks really, really different, and I'm noticing that this person is not behaving in the way they usually do. So taking a look at each type under stress and what kind of opportunities there are in the grip, really helping people identify the remedies and what they can do in the moment. And I think a lot of times leaders have the wherewithal and understanding of what to do and how to make good choices, but put anyone in a stressful situation, and sometimes we lose access to those resources. So having a common and fluent knowledge of, yes, this is what happens to me when I'm stressed, and these are the steps that I need to take to make sure that I'm paying attention to the impact on myself, my productivity in my work, and also the people on my team who are affected. So when we're thinking about leveraging style differences and really looking at how on teams the things have the most impact are on the CPI 260, dominance and empathy. And as I said earlier, if there's someone that has a high score in dominance, above 70, especially when we start to see 74, 75, this is a person who in a team meeting can kind of, I know there's a term for this, but the person who really capitalizes on taking a lot of time and really is the voice that you hear most often in that conversation. They really don't allow a lot of time and space for other people to share their input, and they're really kind of, hogging airtime, for lack of a better word. And that's when there's a lack of empathy present. When someone has a balance of dominance and empathy, there's a little bit more of a concerted effort to have inroads with each person on the team. And, depending on the type and depending on the preferences, and if they're flexing their preferences well, a person may not need to have relationships in the same way as others, but they know how to govern the relationship so that they can be productive. And even, let's say, if someone has a very clear preference for thinking, of course that does not indicate that they cannot flex to their feeling preference to check in with people at the beginning of meetings, to follow up with them to see how they're doing, and to really check in to see, well, what's happening for them as they continue within the organization. The other thing that we see in terms of the expression of dominance and empathy is, as we think about leadership and how it's expressed, there are those leaders that we know behind the scenes, they are making things happen, they're doing meetings, they're just doing them maybe one-on-one, and these are the leaders that maybe don't have as much visibility within the organization because they tend to be, they tend to advocate less for themselves and maybe even more for others, but those are people that maybe have to stretch and flex their introverted preference a little bit more. When we think about how some of the skills like dominance and empathy look on the 260 for introverts, for example, we know that people can flex to the other side of that preference and express themselves well in situations. But for example, on a team meeting, we know that people that have an introverted process want to take a couple of minutes to really integrate the information and think about it, and then they answer in an articulate way. As we know with extroverts, they kind of talk and speak at the same time. And with someone who has a pretty clear preference for extroversion, that comes very naturally, and we might see that dominance coming through in meetings. So it's important to take into account how the expression of their introversion and extroversion impacts what leadership looks like in terms of their decision making, in terms of their judgment, in terms of their ability to share empathy with others. And I think we need to remind ourselves, because oftentimes people who are leaders with a preference for introversion aren't sharing as much information about the impact that they're having on others, but we know it's happening behind the scenes. So moving forward, looking at competencies needed to progress through the organization, as I said earlier, one of the things that we know throughout the life cycle is when someone achieves mastery in their role and they have done all of the things in their job description well and they're performing well, and we know that they're ready to hit the next level, whatever that is, how do we help them to really hone in on the skills that are necessary and take a look at, in this role as a leader, I really needed to collaborate and make sure that I was sharing information. But now as a leader, I have to manage up more, and I have to make sure that I have FaceTime and conversations with people at the C-suite level to make sure that they know what my team is doing. So maybe you don't have as much time with your team now as you did. Maybe when you've advanced to this level, you have to find a way of balancing both of those things. And I think that understanding your style, both on the MBTI and the 260, it becomes critical in terms of, understanding what people see first. And what I mean by what people see first is, with your MBTI, people see your dominant preference first. So, for example, I'm an ENTJ. People see my logic first, and then they see my ideas. My thinking preference first, and then my intuition. With the CPI 260, we can get an idea of, when you're in a challenging situation, go to your strengths first, because hopefully that's what you have access to. Now again, when you're in the grip of stress, you're going to have to learn and manage with self-awareness what you need to do to remedy that situation. But in the best of circumstances, you can lead with that which you feel most comfortable with. And MBTI theory really speaks to the first half of your life you spend mastering that dominant function and that auxiliary function. And then as you pass through the middle of your life, let's say 50 for lack of a better word, or lack of a better number, then you start to work on those less preferred functions, the tertiary function, the inferior function, and you can see that over time. When you look at leaders who have matured in the organization, they do start paying attention if they are invested in their self-awareness, and we know it's not always aligned that as a person ages that they mature. But we hope that that's true. We hope that someone continues to focus on their self-awareness. So if we're paying attention to that functional pair, those two letters in the middle, and understanding their leadership style, we can really pay attention to not only the dominant preference that people see first, but are you also offering some of the strengths that come from your preferences in terms of your auxiliary preference and some of the talent that you have in that area. When you look at what's needed within your new leadership position, the 260 can really help in terms of saying, okay, I know that traditionally I'm someone who has been very structured, I like organization, and now that I'm managing up in a different way, things are changing at rapid pace throughout the organization, and I need to learn to be more flexible. How can I do that? How can I learn to be more flexible? And that's where it's important to work with your clients and in your people one-on-one to say, what does flexibility look like when it's used well within your organization? When it's executed well, what does it look like? And what are some people within the organization that can serve as role models to you? How are the leaders using flexibility in terms of critical thinking, decision-making, and project planning well, so that, yes, there's a backup plan, yes, there's an option for things to come in differently, but in the moment, you can use and flex your preferences and your style so that the appropriate style is used. And then finally, in terms of succession planning, what do you need to pay attention to in terms of your development in order to reach the next level of your cycle? I think one of the things that I've been hearing so often lately with clients is that people, over the course of the past 5 years, have struggled with feeling valued. They know that they're doing a good job. They know that the approach that they're making within the organization is making an impact, but people aren't speaking to that level of being, expressing their appreciation. And, there have been a lot of books about this, from the, excuse me, the book on carrots, about how they did a longitudinal study about what was an important quality in developing leaders, and what did leaders feel like it gave them the most development as they advanced in organizations, and the answer was praise and appreciation. And so making sure that people feel valued, and specifically for what they do. It's not good enough to say good job now. I think you need to say, what I really liked about your presentation was that you balanced the specific data with the impact on our organization and how that's going to have a vision for the future. So really being specific about that feedback so that people know what other people appreciate about them. And again, as you're moving into a position of succession planning, maybe those two functional pair, the dominant and the auxiliary function, those have worked well for you, but it's going to be time perhaps to use those less preferred functions and preferences on the MBTI. And that does mean it's a little bit harder, and it's flexing some muscles that don't come as naturally. But again, as you develop as a leader, it will be important to expand the scope and the breadth of the applications of what you're capable of doing. And again, on the CPI 260, that snapshot page, page 14 of the report, can really give you an indication of where it's important in terms of advancing. And I'm going to go back, I'm going to go back for a second to this slide in terms of onboarding. When a person gets to the next level in the organization, it's almost as if they need to reacclimate from an onboarding standpoint. So using these two instruments, let's say, I was working with a chief technology officer, and he was talking about, really encouraging managers and leaders to innovate beyond their comfort zone and what they were typically doing. And so how you would work with someone within using their function pairs and the style becomes, okay, this person is an innovator. They like to stretch and push the envelope. They like to really be a person that challenges the institution. So if that person falls within the sensing and thinking preferences, here are some ways they might behave. They might really be tough and reasonable. We might see someone who's an innovator as a sensing and feeling preference use their kindness to make an impact, and that's what people will remember of them. The intuitive feeler might get everyone excited about the project and show their flexibility, and the intuitive thinker might show their creativity and determination. So becoming more familiar with the intersect of these two, I think as you're developing and helping managers and leaders grow, it is like onboarding at every level, because now you have new job responsibilities. You have a title that requires some different competencies, and I think it's important to really take a look at what's necessary at each level. And typically people have the technical expertise, or they can learn it, either through experience on the job, or they can go to training outside or inside of the organization. But I think that what we hear most often is where people need our help is with these things that have to do with more of emotional intelligence. Number one, understanding their styles. And I think just having the language where you understand, yes, this is something that happens to me naturally, and this is something that I can work on. And going back to the area where you're familiar with what happens, and the phrase in the grip, for those of you that aren't as familiar with MBTI, comes from Naomi Quank, and she talks about being in the grip of stress where you don't recognize yourself and you're behaving outside of your typical dominant and auxiliary functions, so people think your behavior is a little off and a little odd. But once we recognize where we go when we're feeling in the grip, it's almost like when you have a feeling that you're tired and you're getting a cold and you're feeling sick, once you recognize you're sick, you know what to do. You have to sleep and take care of yourself and rest. But until you recognize that you're sick, you just kind of wonder what's going on. And I think the same thing happens when we're stressed. When we are operating on momentum, we're moving full steam ahead, it's almost like we don't pause enough. We're not mindful enough to recognize the time that we really need to stop and take a breath and say, wow, I'm working 14, 16 hours a day. I'm probably not even getting 8 hours of work done because I'm spinning my wheels when it comes to being productive. And that's because you're operating from your least preferred preference, and you're not really leveraging your competencies and leveraging those things that come most natural to you. So I would try to familiarize yourself with this chart in terms of paying attention to the competencies that impact self-management and core performance, and what to do, the remedies. I think having a place to go and knowing what to do in the absence of feeling like you're yourself and operating under your regular functions, I think having a strategy and plan becomes critically important, especially because other people are depending on you as well. Okay. And in terms of, we've talked about so much of these two instruments and their interactions, and I could probably talk for many more hours because the prospect of using this data to help people is really exciting to me. But I guess when I think about using these two instruments, the opportunity comes in terms of professional development. Where do you see the most opportunity for the individual to work on what they're doing well and enhance it? And I guess that depends on your philosophy. Are you of the philosophy that you work on what you're doing well and increase that, or you want to work a little bit on what you could do better and increase that? The Gallup polls on that say if you put more energy into what you do well, it'll be much a much better investment of your time than trying to work on the things that you just don't have a lot of talent in. And I think somewhat I agree with that, but I also think there is attention that's needed to the areas that you don't have as much talent. Either you get a team together where there's other people who have those talents and they can help you, or you recognize it's something that's going to have to take a little bit more of your time. The other thing that I think is really important is giving people that you work with an opportunity to drive their own development. When you sit with someone and you do an interpretation of the MBTI and the CPI 260, there's a lot of information to follow up and talk about insights and an action plan, and these are 3 things that you can do. What can you do tomorrow? When you go back to work, what can you do today that's going to make the most impact? And also, knowing what you know about yourself and your strengths and style, how can you share those resources and best practices, especially when people are feeling stuck? And I'm also a big proponent of using the data and the assessments to really let people think about what does this mean and what's going to be the impact on my style as a leader, and how do I stretch myself to be a more effective leader, and what are the specific actions I need to take. Because a lot of times, you know, for those of you that have done 360s and that kind of feedback, sometimes the first time you do a debrief with someone, it doesn't stick. They have a hard time hearing that that information could possibly be true, and having data from multiple data sources sometimes helps to say, well, we've got 2 different instruments that are saying the same thing. We've got feedback from your 360 that's saying the same thing. And we have your performance review from this year that's saying the same thing. You're the only one here that's not saying that any of this is true. So what do you think's going on? And having a conversation about that. And so that's one of the things that I think that's really important in terms of getting started. Okay, I am recognizing the time. So I know that Laura has been paying attention to some of the questions that are posted. Laura, do you want to address some of those now?
Yes, thank you, Sarita. We do have a lot of good questions, so let's get started. Are you ready, Sarita?
I'm ready.
We have a question. How have you seen this used or validated during military or emergency management settings?
So one of the great things, and part of the reasons why I use the CPI 260, and I've used it with the Air Force, with the Special Forces Marines, with the Navy in San Diego, and with the Army, actually. And in all of those situations, people need to operationalize quickly, and when people have information about their strengths and style, especially in a crisis, they know the kinds of things that they can lean on that they do well. And as a team, they can pool their resources and say, okay, here's where I have talent. Here's where I have talent. I'm going to take this piece. You take this piece. And it really helps them to operationalize and put together a plan in terms of where they need to go for what kinds of talent. And in a crisis, you know, understanding the grip function of the Myers-Briggs is helpful in terms of understanding your own behavior and knowing where you tend to go in terms of your behavior in a crisis, and then knowing what kinds of steps and actions that you take to reboot yourself to get yourself back to that dominant level of functioning where you're using that dominant function and really operating from the best possible place with your preferences.
Great. Someone else is asking, does one's CPI lifestyle change over time with different jobs, roles, or experiences, or is it like the MBTI that's always a certain preference?
It's a great question. We don't see those lifestyles change that much over the course of time. Now, similar to the theory on the MBTI, if you take the MBTI more than once and you recognize that one of those preferences changes, it's likely because you had a slight preference to begin with, and you were probably right in the mid-zone with one of those 4 preferences, and then you moved to a slight preference on the other side. And the 260, the CPI 260, has a similar aspect. If you're right on the line, there's an x-axis and a y-axis and in those 4 vectors. And if you're right on the line, we sometimes see changes to the other side of that line. But mostly and consistently, people tend to perform even within different roles within the same lifestyle.
Great. So on the CPI 260, Someone is asking, what is the optimal range you'd like to see on the flexibility scale?
Okay.
So
So
you talked about flexibility quite a bit.
yeah, so most of the scores we want to see between 40 and 70. Flexibility, when it sits around, most managers we see around 50, 55, because that basically means that for the most part, they will not be afraid to take risks, usually more calculated risks. We don't want to see flexibility really for a leader or manager at 75, because then that's when people kind of come across as being kind of too erratic and too maybe even impulsive at times. But when it sits right around that mean, right around 50, 55, then we know, and even in the high 50s, but really in that range, we know that that's a person who's going to pause before they make a decision or a choice, but they're not going to, dig their heels in so much that people aren't going to be able to have input in the important decisions that they make. And that's what we see when we see someone who's closer to 40, someone who is really, really rigid and has a hard time shifting when something changes within the organization.
Great. Thanks, Sarita. Someone wrote in a question and said, I get a lot of pushback about the validity and reliability of the MBTI. Is there information available other than what is in the MBTI manual that I can give to those individuals? And what about the CPI 260 validity and reliability data?
So the CPI 260 validity and reliability, I mean, the instrument averages, I think it's around 0.72 in terms of the average across the scales. Now some scales have higher. I think the lowest reliability on the 260 is law enforcement orientation, and that's at around a 0.4. And the highest is dominance, which is around 0.86. But I think the average across scales for reliability on the 260 is 0.72, which is really, really, when you think about acceptable limits of reliability, that's really, really good. So one of the things I think with the CPI, because it comes from the previous incarnation of the CPI 434, there's so much data on the consistency of the instrument. And certainly if you want research, if you want articles, CPP's research department has a wealth of information about studies and ways in which the CPI validity and reliability has been reinforced. And I would say the same thing for the MBTI. What I think happens with the MBTI is that base validity is usually pretty high in terms of people recognize, yes, that sounds like me. But if someone changes over time, even if they're slight on the instrument, they think, oh, well, the instrument must not be working very well. But actually, before 1996, 1995, 1996, when the Form M was revised, then there were two different scoring used. It used to be kind of cluster scoring, precision ratio scoring, and then they moved to item response theory. And item response theory moves to including every single item, and that actually increased the reliability and the validity of the MBTI. So when people say, oh, this is not really, this is the kind of, instrument that doesn't have validity, then, they really haven't spent time doing the research, because if you look, it's there. And we see those levels with the MBTI actually at 0.8 and even some above that in terms of, with reliability, we're talking about consistency and repeatability of results. And time again, 75% of people will say, yes, this is the last time I took the assessment, I was an ENTJ, and again, I am an ENTJ. So we're seeing that consistency. But I do get those questions, especially from scientists and engineers that want to see all the data, and I absolutely share that with them because I want them to feel comfortable with the instruments that we're using. And I will say, these instruments, here's the numbers of reliability, here's the numbers of validity, and whatever studies you'd like to see within your excuse me, within your field, I can show you data about what an electrical engineer looks like in terms of the reliability of test retest. And that's a lot of that's in the manual. Outside of the manual, I have really relied on CPP's research department and CAPT for those kinds of articles. And people ask, not all the time, but people do ask, and I really, I always want to answer that question because I want people to feel comfortable. I know that's a long answer to a short question.
Oh, but great. Thank you so much. Here's an interesting one. Would you suggest to reassess at each leadership turn when someone takes a new leadership role?
I hear that question a lot. And some companies use the CPI 260 in a pre and post measure. Let's say they're putting someone through a 12-month leadership program, and they'll say, okay, at the beginning we want you to take the MBTI, the 50B, the TKI, the CPI 260, and we're going to look at your strengths and style, and we're going to reassess you over the next year. With MBTI, it stays pretty consistent, so what I will do is if they haven't taken the step 2, I'll make sure they take the step 2 so they can take a look at the facets and see if there's been any of those out of preference scores that are newly developed habits, maybe out of some competencies that they've had to develop so that they can take a look at those out of preference scores. So then I will say, yes, if you haven't taken the step 2, let's do the step 2. With the CPI 260, that is the kind of instrument that if someone works on certain skills and practices, we can see changes, especially with those dealing with other scales. That first group of scales, dominance, empathy, those are the kinds of things where people can show different kinds of behaviors. And I have done a reassessment of that. I think 3 months is too short. Most of the time I want to give people 6, 9, ideally 9 to 12 months to really practice behaviors and really integrate those new behaviors. And that's when we really can see, especially with those dealing with others scales, we can see those scales move. Now, in the self-management scales, the second group of scales, we don't see those scales move that much. For example, responsibility is one of the scales on self-management. Now, how do you teach people to have a better work ethic and to be more responsible for the work that they're doing? Yes, you can encourage it, but that's something, again, that someone's going to have to work on for themselves. And we would be better, it would be a better investment of our time in that dealing with others scale to really take a look at how we want to work with someone around the way that they're demonstrating leadership, the way that they're showing their dominance, how they're practicing showing empathy for others, and the kinds of things that they're doing within that first, their social presence. We think of leaders and the way they present themselves as a really important component to front-facing presentations, and that triangle of sociability, social presence, and self-acceptance is something that people can really work on. And I've done pre- and post studies where we have seen significant changes from 5 to 10 points of someone who's worked on their presentation skills, someone who's worked on making decisions more independently, and someone that's worked on maybe curtailing some of their dominance so that they're more collaborative, or increasing some of their empathy so that they're able to be more versatile and understand others better. So that's absolutely something that people do as part of leadership development programs, is to assess and reassess. Again, I would give people 6 to 9 months to make those changes, ideally at a year, but 3 months is too short. I think, it's kind of like, pulling a souffle out of the oven too early. It's not going to work. So you want to give people an opportunity to really marinate and play with opportunities for their development.
Okay, Sarita, thank you so much, and everybody who's been attending our webinar. Unfortunately, we were unable and ran out of time to get to some of the really, really good questions that everybody has sent in. Sarita will be contacting you individually to answer your questions. Sarita, can you advance the slide quickly?
Oh, sure.
is offering a time-limited discount on our certification programs of the MBTI and CPI, as well as some of our MBTI and CPI 260 products. You'll be getting more information in a communication from us soon about the recording of the resources and this offer. And we've come to the end of today's webinar, and we thank everyone for joining us today, and especially to you, Sarita, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Goodbye, everybody.